And the theory was that if you knew that they were building artificial harbors, you knew that they were coming at Normandy, which was the case. And so they had to protect that secret guard it very jealously. And so I toyed with that notion, and it was a deception upon a deception upon a deception. And it did very well. It was on the Times list for about 5 weeks, if I remember correctly, and it started the ball rolling for me.
I find it fascinating that now that we are at a sufficient remove from the Second World War, that all kinds of aspects of it, which you've obviously deal with in some of your later books, have come out that would have been impossible to write about shortly after the war. Swiss banking, a lot of the tangle over stolen art, things like that. The whole bit about the Catholic Church and hiding, Nazis and whatever.
Right.
Did you write about World War II because it engaged you, or because it's a little bit easier, to stand at a distance and
it engages
me.
It engaged me. It engages me still, and I have just enjoyed watching Europe wrestle with these questions about what I call the unfinished business of the Holocaust in the last few years. Part of it is just time and archives being opened and records and historians finally digging, and sometimes it takes a while for stuff to float to the surface, and also it needs a period of reassessment as well.
Yeah.
And that's really what happened with the Vatican. But it is the event that shaped our modern world like no other, in my opinion, and I like sifting through the threads of it.
I think it's fascinating. I have a lot of trouble with World War I for some reason or other. It's a period in history. To me, it's so tragic because nothing actually, in the end, they weren't fighting for the same kinds of goals, and in the end, there was this horrible slaughter for what?
Because a terrorist in Sarajevo assassinated an archduke, and the alliances were lined up. I mean, I've thought about toying with that. The start of the war. The start of the war to me is always the tragedy of the war, and then of course it leads to this terrible slaughter and stalemate on the battlefields of Europe.
But it was really much more of a game. I mean, you had all these political alignments that sort of came in. I thought, World War II was a war that was, I thought, easier to identify.
Certainly.
The issues.
Good versus evil.
Yeah, it really was. And I often marvel, too. I mean, one of the things as a student of history I just find completely fascinating is why didn't Hitler read more about Napoleon, or at least, why didn't he apply it?
This great battlefield tactician that fights a war in the West and then turns and invades Russia.
Falls right into the same, and I mean, I don't know if it was hubris or what it was.
Hubris.
Do you think that was the motivating deal?
Yeah.
Or just because he couldn't manage to get England, so he had to go and turn the other direction?
He always wanted it, and thought he could take it all, and it was the great mistake. And unfortunately for the Jews, it was the trigger that led to the Holocaust, because he invades Russia and suddenly finds himself, and I forget the numbers, but it must have been around 8 million Jews living within territory that he now ruled. And that was too many, and so Operation Barbarossa would turn out to be, Hitler's mistake would also turn out to be a terrible trigger for European Jewish community. It would lead to their destruction.
Well, you've come to that with the books about Ellen, but before that, you wrote 2 books after The Unlikely Spy, and if I remember, it was Northern Ireland.
I wrote a book called The Mark of the Assassin. Was the second one. It was a sort of a political thriller dealing, set largely in Washington, but around Europe as well, dealing with the downing of an American jet and who was behind it. Then I wrote a book set in Northern Ireland called The Marching Season.
And that had the same character, right?
Had the same character, a guy named Michael Osborne, a CIA counterterrorism officer. And while the books did fine, I wasn't entirely happy with them. I felt I had done some things right and learned some things, but I was ready for a new character, and started making the early sketches for a book that would eventually be called The Kill Artist, starring a guy named Gabriel Allon. And I'm sure glad I picked him up, because he's been a godsend.
He's fabulous. That's when I came to read you. The reason I'm a little shaky on the earlier books
That's
is
okay.
the first one I read, in fact. Well, they've just been reprinted, so it's
Yeah.
been hard to read them for a while. The first one I read was The Kill Artist. But, you know, it's interesting thinking about Northern Ireland. For some reason or other, there are just areas of the world or particular conflicts that don't seem to engage American readers. It's very difficult to do well with Northern Ireland. It's just
You
the same
know,
way that Africa
I
is tough.
probably learned that lesson. I think I was more interested than a lot of readers were, to be honest with you. And while I don't regret having written the book, it didn't do as well as some of my other ones.
Do you have any idea why it seems to be kind of a...
I don't know,
terrain?
because I live in the East, where there are large Irish communities. And I grew up and lived in the Bay Area, where there was a huge Irish community, and so there was always interest in what was going on in Northern Ireland, where I lived. And so I guess I'm not as familiar with the rest of the country as those other areas, but I think that where I lived, there was always a lot of interest in the story. New York, San Francisco.
Often, just as a bookseller, I often marvel on the things that do well. You can sell almost anything set in Italy, and Germany, almost impossible. France, very tough. Africa, almost impossible. Only recently, really after the Cold War ended in probably the mid-90s, did people begin to move into the Far East. And so there were thrillers, some very fine thrillers or other kinds of books that were set there. But I'm always curious, you know, to sort of figure out why readers will go some places with alacrity and then seem sort of indifferent to others. And it's not about the writer. It's not obviously the quality of your book at all.
But I also think that to sit around and try to guess what they want to read is probably not terribly helpful.
Oh, no.
And I think with my first 3 novels, I really consciously tried to write what I thought were commercial thrillers that were going to be commercially viable. And when I just started writing the books that I wanted to write, they did a lot better.
You said actually a name that probably had some influence on you, Jack Higgins, because if anybody has in fact written much about Ireland, or, you know, what is the name of his guy, Sean something?
He has a new character named Sean Dillon.
That's it.
He was an early influence on my work. I wouldn't really count him on as one of the guys who's influenced me in later stages of my career.
But if you've read him, that would have been some exposure.
Definitely.
No, interestingly enough, Alan First was somebody whose books we used to bring over from England when he was kind of wandering in the wilderness before he wrote the...
Polish officer?
No, you know, it was the Kingdom. I'm going blank on the title. The one with the Hungarian...
Kingdom of Shadows?
Yeah, thank you. The Hungarian that comes to Paris, and it got a brilliant review in the New York Times. And it was like everybody said, "Oh, you know, look at this." I mean, here he'd been all this time, and then there's been a great interest in his work. I've always been a fan of Graham Greene. I've always liked the moral dilemmas that are at the heart of his books.
He's my man.
He is.
Yeah.
Well, how do you feel about Eric Ambler?
I worship Eric Ambler.
See, I was asked to do a quote for Dan Fesperman the other day, who's another writer I think is working in the same sort of.
I have a book of his that came in the mail the other day that I'm really dying to read when I.
Which one did you get?
I don't know. It's set in the Balkans.
Well, he wrote Lie in the Dark.
That's it.
Which is his first novel, won the John Creasy Best First Novel Dagger from the Crime Writers. Brilliant book set in Sarajevo.
Yep.
Really liked it a lot. Then he wrote A Small Boat of Great Sorrows, which, as part of our discussion, where the detective is in Berlin. And again, all kinds of echoes of World War II. It's like Sins of the Fathers, you know, raining down on sons. But also, and we're just kind of, I think, at the outside edge where this is possible, a particular military figure from World War II is still alive and still doesn't want to be found. And, you know, I think in terms of chronology, we're kind of getting to the end where that is a possible thing to do, to write a book in 2004 about somebody who was, you know, an active officer in the 40s is getting to be a stretch, but he has one in there. And I just think he writes brilliantly about the war theater and about the kinds of issues that have always engaged the writers I mentioned, but also engage you.